old. I was in the 8th grade. I remember staying in my room that whole Sunday morning, flipping through channels, and there was some guy preaching. It was a televangelist.
Every time you hear the gospel and do nothing about it, you're in trouble. You're in eternal trouble.
And I'll never forget, I got down on my knees next to my bed, and it was at that moment that God became real to me. When I went to college, get to do all the foolish things, get to do some of the right things, and now I was at a moment in college where I was totally helpless. The first ever track meet that I ran in, 30 meters and completely tore my hamstring and face planted on the track. I went through a really hard season, and I was frustrated and sad, depressed, where I didn't even really want to go to church because I felt like churches had let me down. I literally had people who knew something had happened in my life, who knew I had fallen off the map, who sought me out and said, "This is not the Matt that we know God's called you to be." My name's Matt Anderson, born in 1977. Just moved around a lot as a kid. My dad was a salesman who traveled around, moved from Biloxi to Houston to Dallas to Oakland to Maryland. But here's what I do remember. Every time we moved, my parents always found a church. We were always in a church wherever we moved, whatever was going on. We always had a lot going on, but I always found myself in a church from as early as I can remember. So I guess I'm the one who grew up in church, grew up hearing about Jesus, grew up hearing about God, grew up with all that. Now, as a kid, I did not like moving around because I felt like every 2 or 3 years I had to start over. And my personality's naturally, you wouldn't believe it, but naturally I'm an introvert. At my heart, I like to revert back. I'm not always outgoing and don't generally want to just get to know everyone. So yeah, it was hard moving around. It was a little bit of a challenge, but it made me into who I am today. Growing up in church made me into who I am today. I remember walking down an aisle at youth events. I remember raising my hands when it was time to get saved. I remember all these things. But I really remember there was a day when I was 13 years old. I was in the 8th grade, all this growing up in church my whole life. It was on one day that my family actually didn't go to church. I don't know why we didn't go to church, but I remember staying in my room that whole Sunday morning, flipping through channels, and there was some guy preaching. It was a televangelist. He was preaching a message, and he was walking through the gospel. The same gospel I'd heard my whole life, but for some reason on that Sunday morning in my room, home alone, listening to that message of the hope that we all need in Jesus Christ rang true in my life. And although I had heard it and I had responded to it, this was the time that it really rung true in my heart. And I'll never forget, as he gave the gospel message at the end of his sermon, that I got down on my knees next to my bed and just went through the prayer that he prayed. And it was at that moment that really God became real to me. The fact that I needed a Savior and that nothing I could do would get me close to God and that life wasn't working on my own. And the only way it would work was if I had a relationship with Jesus. And I'll never forget that day and that moment praying that prayer and really opening my heart up to God in that moment. Now, was I 13 and was I still probably a little bit crazy? Yes. But I remember going to church, and from that day forward, it was like all of a sudden everything the preacher preached about made sense to me. It connected with me in a way that it hadn't connected with before. Went to church, went to youth group, did all those things. I can't say I was living right just for God. I was also just a little scared of getting in trouble too. So, but generally trying to live right. Not always perfect, not always making the right decisions, but trying to do the right thing as much of that as a teenager could. But I will tell you, when it really took the next level for me, when I went to college and I was 18, What really took my faith to the next level was now I'm all alone. I'm able to make choices on my own, living in a college dorm, get to do all the foolish things, get to do some of the right things. It was my freshman year in college that a friend of mine invited me to attend a Bible study on campus. And sure, I had accepted Jesus. I had opened my heart to him, but this was when I was really doing it on my own. And a friend invited me to a Bible study. I'll never forget, it was a Thursday night. I walked into this Bible study, and man, it was just some really great, amazing people having this little mini church service. And I just remember connecting with God in there on a deeper level, and my faith really becoming my own faith. Not too soon after that, I ran track my first year in college. The first ever track meet that I ran in college was the first leg of a 4x100 relay. First ever meet, first ever race, first leg in the relay, and got out of the blocks running the 100 meters, and probably 30 meters in completely tore my hamstring and face planted on the track. And they literally had to carry me off the track. Why was that such an important moment for me? My faith had become real. It was my faith, and now I was at a moment in college, my freshman year, where I was totally helpless. I couldn't do anything on my own. I had to have crutches. I had to have people carry stuff for me. And here I am trying to live right, trying to do the right thing for Jesus, and I find myself screaming in pain and now having to have people help me with everything. My emotions were pain, frustration, anger. I just really couldn't realize why that's happening to me at the very beginning of something that I thought was going to be a great fun time running track in college, and that really sidelined me, and I never got to really recover from that injury. And that was just really, for me, the moment where it was like, you know what, you're going to have to not depend on yourself to get through this life, where I had nothing to cling to but God. So that was kind of how I made it through that. And I had great people surrounding me who were trying to live for Jesus at a young age. And I'll just never forget how hard it was in that season, but how my faith became real, how I really wanted to dive into His Word and learn about that, and how I just forged some great friendships that I have even to this day. And that was like, man, I don't know, how old am I now? To then, that was like 30 years ago, 25 to 30 years ago. And some of those friends I still keep in touch with now because of the impact God made in my life during that season. So, you know, even as a 40-something-year-old man, I can still feel where my hamstring was torn. I can still feel the divot in my hamstring, but it's just a reminder of how God used a moment of pain to draw me closer to Him. So I was at a school called Salisbury University. It's in Maryland, on the eastern shore of Maryland, close to Ocean City, Maryland. The funny little story I didn't tell you earlier was when I walked into this Bible study on that Thursday night, it was, some of you have heard of, it's kind of old school. They don't even call it this anymore, but it was, back then it was called the Impact Movement of Campus Crusade for Christ. What that meant basically was when I walked in, I was the only white person in the room. So that was the uniqueness to the story. I was like, whoa, okay. I was the only white person in the room, and it was like everybody was clapping and singing and worshiping, and I was like, this is new, because I had naturally always grown up in churches that were predominantly white. So the cool thing about that was it was some teammates that I had in college, and I just remember how powerful the worship was, and the student who got up and then taught the mini sermon was just so creative. He's actually a teaching pastor at his church now in Maryland, amazing man of God who was kind of a mentor to me in college. And I just remember, I loved the environment. I love how the Word of God became real, and I was like, man, this is where I'm going to be as long as I'm in college. So I was actually a part of that ministry at that college for the 3 years that I was at that college. It was really cool. So after college, I graduated with a degree in electrical engineering and physics. And I had a lot of job offers, and I took a job in Texas. I grew up in Maryland, went to Salisbury University, then finished school at University of Maryland, College Park. And I got a job as an engineer here in Texas with an amazing company right here in Plano, and came here to work. And when I moved here, I moved away from my community, I moved away from people I knew, I moved away from my church. So when I moved here, it was the first 3 or 4 months here, being a young man with a good job and a good paycheck and feeling lonely, that I started making some bad choices. So for that first few months here, I started hanging with the wrong crowd, started making bad decisions, spending my money on wrong things. And it was really in a low point that God's like, you know that guy you used to listen to? He's there in Dallas. That's how you need to hit the reset button. But I used to listen to this preacher on the radio named Tony Evans. And then I moved to Texas, and I'm like, I think that guy's church is in Texas that I used to listen to in college. And I found the church in Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, and I started attending church in 2001. And that was where I met a young man back in 2001 named Conway Edwards. He was at that church as well. So we met way back in 2001, and I just started attending church there and really just loved attending. And him and another mentor of mine, I really had another mentor named Pastor Womack, who really guided me along in ministry and in faith and got me involved in singles ministry there, and just started serving and volunteering and just doing little bits and pieces here and there. And that's actually where I met my wife. Anissa was in the singles ministry at Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, and just had a great time growing in ministry there. And it wasn't after 3 years that I actually had resigned my job as an engineer to become an intern there at the church, and started an internship there. Slowly started walking away from being an engineer and felt the call to God, from God, for full-time ministry. I didn't just up and quit everything. It was like a 2-year process for me. It's like, God, do you want me to do this? Do you not want me to do it? Are you going to send me an email or a text and tell me what you want me to do? I didn't get any of those things. Since I didn't get those things, what did I do? I just took one faith step at a time. Maybe I'll go take a class at the local seminary. Maybe I'll lead in, volunteer leadership role. And I just took step by step by step by step. One of the things I did was I started living my life as if that was the direction I was going to go. I did not know if I was going to go that direction, but I said, let's live my life like that now. So what did that mean for me? I had just graduated. I had been on this job for about a year, had a good paycheck. What did I do? I started attempting to live off of half of my salary. I started acting as if this is the direction I was going to live. So I sold the car that I had. I had bought an expensive car when I got my job. I sold it and got a car that cost half as much. I started living in an apartment that cost less. I started trying to live off of half of my income. So before I even walked away from being an engineer, I had already scaled back my lifestyle for over a year. So I was already walking in these faith steps. I didn't have to take this big leap or this big jump because I was already doing it. The last step in the faith journey was being an intern there at the church and walking away from my job as they offered me a full-time position. So that's kind of what my faith journey looked like from that point, not just faith, but actually walking into full-time ministry as well. Same time I was getting married, and just everything was happening. And it was just a great time to walk in faith, to learn, to grow, to take big, bold moves for Jesus Christ. When I was an intern at Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, nothing was easy, but there was like a passion inside of me for the different things that I was working in. I was working in the thing called the Bible Institute, which was our adult discipleship program, and we had classes for adults almost every night of the week. I was messing up a lot. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't know what I was doing. We were starting to experience a little bit of success and forward progress, and that's the grace of God. So I wasn't just hitting up against a wall, but things were actually working that I was trying, and I had great leaders guiding me and walking me through the process. I wasn't figuring it out on my own. And then I was at school at the time. I was going to seminary. So that was really the cool thing, was I had a place to apply everything that I was learning, and really growing me into some of the leaders I had back then over 20 years ago, Pastor Conway being one of those. But the other leaders in my life at that time just giving me kind of a laboratory to be able to test out what I was learning. And then it was really, as it unfolded, they offered me a full-time position in that area and in other areas as well. But it was an easy step because I could see the path God was laying out. I was really in tune with what God was trying to do in my life at that time. Being on staff where Dr. Tony Evans is the pastor, can you believe that? Getting to meet amazing, great pastors and mentors and leaders. And there was a time after a few years there that myself and my mentor, one of the other pastors of the church, felt called to plant a new church. So we left Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship. We started a church in Fort Worth, Texas. We went all the way to Funky Town, and we started a church that's still doing great there in Fort Worth. But I kind of went on a different path, and that church got going, and I was at that church for a couple years and then had a transition from that church. It was a tough transition, and my family and I were trying to figure out what was next after we left that new church we had helped plant. We'd been there about 2 years or so, and we found ourselves wondering. I was kind of like roaming through the desert as to what's next, because I left there and I told everybody that God told me to do it, and I thought God did, but I didn't have another job lined up. And then I was unemployed, and I was married and had a kid, and life got really hard really fast. I got a job teaching 8th and 9th graders algebra. I'm really telling you the quick version of this story, but it was not the plan that I thought I was headed towards. And we found a great church in the middle of not knowing where I was going to go and having my heart broken by some other churches I thought I was going to work at. We found a great church in Keller, Texas that we started attending, and that was really my season of healing. I had been somebody who had been a pastor on staff at a church, and that was my identity, and my identity was taken away. Really, you could say it was taken away, or you could say I walked away from it. I don't know which one it was, but I began to wrestle with, who am I when I'm not the title in front of my name? So when I had my heart broken from walking away from a church, thinking I was going to go work here, man, my faith was really shattered. I went through a really hard season where I didn't even really want to go to church because I felt like churches had let me down. And it was really hard. The thing that really carried me through were relationships I had before that hard season. I could not have gotten myself out of that hard season. I literally had people who had walked with me before that, who knew something had happened in my life, who knew I had fallen off the map, who sought me out and said, this is not the Matt that we know God's called you to be. And we don't really know what's going on, but this is not the story God has for you. And I literally had people, one friend of mine at that time, I remember taking me to Starbucks, calling that out in my life. Then I had another newer friend in my life, an older gentleman who was a retired pastor, who just looked into my eyes at a restaurant in Fort Worth and reminded me how much God loved me. I had people from my past, I had people from the present, and it was really God's community calling out that I had stepped into a dark season, and I was frustrated and sad, depressed. I don't know what it was, but I had people that loved me enough to walk alongside of me and help remind me who God called me to be and help speak that truth into my life. That was the only way I made it out of that hard season. And I'll tell you what, I had a wife who was praying for me. She knew that wasn't who God called me to be. And in the midst of that hardest time, the wife praying, friends surrounding me and fighting for me is what ultimately got me back to a place of healing, a place of worship, a place of reconnecting with God. But man, I found a great church that I got to heal at. I got to work as a school teacher. And then after a couple of years, that church was like, hey, we want to bring you to work at this church that you're at. And I was like, okay. And I worked on staff at that church. Now, the whole time I was at that church, Pastor Conway started calling me about every year saying, do you want to come to one community church? And I'm like, no, I don't know if I want to do that new church thing again. That didn't work out too well for me. And, after probably 5 years of conversations, Pastor Conway, finally said, hey, I'm thinking about going multi-site and I want you to be a campus pastor. And I had a great church. Everything was going well. And really, it wasn't like I was really running from anything bad. And really, I probably took a year before I left. And even when I did leave that church to come to One Community Church, we let my pastor at the time set the timeline. I didn't know if he'd want me to leave in a week, 4 weeks, or a year. We said, you know what, as you transition, I had been at that church for 7 years. As you transition out to the new church that you're going to go to, however you see fit for this transition to happen, we'll let that go. And that was kind of how I transitioned. What did he want to do? He wanted me to stay for about another month to help train people and lead people that were in the areas that I was leading at that church. I was like over the small groups and the membership and the guest services. So we had a transition plan, and then slowly I walked from there into joining the staff at One Community Church on August 31st, 2015. I still remember the day, but that was when I came to One Community Church. So now, what has God taught me? He's really shown me that back when I was a new believer, back when I was new in ministry, back when I was getting started in church, back then I had like a whole lot of certainties in my life. I had a lot of things that I thought I knew. The way ministry should go, the way you should do church, the way you should do this, the way you should do that. The older I get, the less I'm sure about in life. The less things I'm certain about. The one thing I'm certain about is the saving work of Jesus Christ in my life and in everyone else's life. But I've learned there were so many things that I held so tightly that I thought I needed to fight for. And the things that I'm willing to fight for have shrunk down. I'm willing to fight for my relationship of who Jesus Christ is. I'm willing to fight for my family. I'm willing to fight for my team and my church. Outside of that, there's very few things that I hold as dear as I used to, because I've began to see throughout life what's most important. And the closer I get to God, the more I come in touch with my own brokenness. The closer I get to God, the more my eyes are open to just how much I'm in need of His grace today. And throughout my life, I've just had the illusion of being in control, the illusion that I'm in charge, that really it is God calling the shots. You hear people say, Jesus, take the wheel. He's already got the wheel. We just have a little steering wheel that's a fake one that doesn't really work. That's where I'm at right now, trying to serve well, trying to love my family well, trying to be a good follower of the leaders in my life today. And the thing I'm confident in is Jesus Christ's love for me, and the fact that I need to come in touch with that love every single day. To somebody else who's trying to figure out, should I do that or should I not do that? Should I go to full-time ministry or not? First of all, I would say, man, you're in full-time ministry no matter where you're at. So if you have a way to do what you do and be a light right where you're at, man, do that. For me, it was a faith journey, and I felt like every step of the way, God was pulling me closer to that. And not only was God pulling me closer to that, I had spiritual leaders in my church who were affirming that call on my life and saying, you know what, we do think this is what God wants for you. They weren't making the decision, but they were affirming it. If you're contemplating that decision and nobody's affirming it, then you have to take a step back and make sure it's not just your decision. You have to make sure, in the Bible, people were sent out into ministry. So you've got to ask yourself, are there people saying, yes, I see that? And when I say people, I don't mean family members, okay? I don't mean family members. I mean trusted people in your church, the body of believers that you call home, that are calling that out in you and affirming that. And I was taking faith steps. At the same time, I had people affirming that in me, and opportunities were opening up. If you don't see opportunities opening up and people aren't calling that out in you and you haven't been taking faith steps, then it might not be the right time for you. You might need to wait for God to open those doors for you. So follow Him, look to your trusted advisors and counsel, and look for the opportunities God gives you. God always talks about us in relationship with other believers. And my life has been one that could not have made it on my own. Every time I was on my own, I failed. It was having other believers around me was how I always got new hope for whatever situation that I was in. So I just want to encourage you to, however you can experience community and relationship with other believers, to fight for that. Even when it's hardest, to fight for that. And even when you have it, to be that for someone else. Because that's how God operates. That's the currency, is relationships and community. And that's how lives are changed. When we really get to know each other. When we really get to know that all of us are just a little bit weird, and that all we got to do is get to know each other, and we'll see how weird we all are, and that's okay, because God loves us that way, and that's how we connect with others. So I want to encourage you, remain steadfast in finding connection and relationship with others. Jesus is the primary person in my life that I can depend on. He's the person that knows me at my absolute worst and still chooses to love me. He's the person that when I mess up and I look to Him, He doesn't have His head down, He has His arms wide open. Jesus is the model of love to me. He's my Savior. He is my Redeemer. He's the only one that I can have a chance at figuring out life. He's the one that gives me an eternal connection to God. And I'm forever grateful for the difference that He's made in my life.